So welcome to the second presentation of Psychology of Forgiveness. What I'd like to do in this is talk about some of the comments that you all made, that some of the students made in response to the readings that we've been doing and the first presentation. And one of the students wrote this excellent post, and it outlines 4 different aspects of forgiveness. And she writes, in my understanding, forgiveness has several steps to it. It begins with the act of turning towards the transgressor, actively seeking to understand the person in an empathic way. And 2, it continues with an internal process of accepting what has happened in a self-compassionate way, not by justifying what's happened or accepting excuses or explanations for it, but by trying to create a feeling of acceptance within yourself towards the fact that human beings are not perfect, and by fostering the feeling that you have what it takes to heal yourself and move past the hurt. This is really excellent. The third step consists of directing your focus and vision of life forward again towards the future. And 4th, whether or not the stage is followed by expressing your forgiveness to the offender is a personal choice and an optional step in the process of forgiveness. So this is a very sophisticated model here that the student is presenting with these 4 different parts. Trying to empathize with the transgressor, so trying to see where they're coming from. Second, accepting what happened. And also accepting the imperfections of the other person, and also recognizing your own resilience. There's a lot in that second step, but it's really about acceptance and moving past the hurt. And then third, looking forward, so a sense of hope in life. And then 4th, there's the optional aspect of expressing your forgiveness. This is a great post. There's actually a lot of stuff in positive psychology that is embedded in this kind of comment here about optimism, hope, acceptance, compassion, empathy, and the interpersonal expression of forgiveness, the interaction with the other person, so on. So really fantastic stuff here. There's a lot we can mine here. Now, as another student, and I'm going to present a couple different excerpts, and there's going to be a little bit of tension between these. So in another excerpt from a student's précis is this. My understanding of forgiveness is that it refers to letting go of one's hatred or grudge against the offender through a critical reflection on the disadvantages of harboring ill thoughts and benefits of forgiveness. Our own experience tells us that when we harbor ill will, we're in a state of tension and our enjoyments are easily disrupted by the appearance of the offender. So what he's saying is that, when you haven't forgiven someone, then even just thinking about them or seeing them, maybe you bump into them, it's going to really make you uncomfortable. And we know that from our own experience. And he goes on to say, conversely, when we forgive or let go of a grudge, we gain a sense of release and calm and ease. So it's like you've let go of this weight inside you. Unless one lets go of one's grudges, there's no room for real forgiveness. For many, the act of forgiving equates with letting the transgressor off the hook and thereby benefiting that person. In reality, however, when one forgives the transgressor, one is actually benefiting oneself. This is because forgiveness involves not dwelling upon anger and resentment, which in turn liberates oneself from the clutches of hatred, whose sole function is to destroy one's mental and joy and inner peace. By not forgiving, the individual holds on to anger like a burning ember, which is corrosive and will erode only one's own peace of mind. He then goes on to say that sometimes we don't forgive because of misconceptions. In fact, he already mentioned one of those, which is the idea that, well, if I forgave that person, I'm kind of saying what they did is okay. I'm letting them off the hook. I'm not, they're not being punished. Of course, that's a misconception, isn't it? Because by me holding on to anger, I'm not actually punishing that other person. It feels like I'm punishing them, but am I really punishing them? I mean, do they even know that I'm holding on to anger? Sometimes, they're far away from us or they're not seeing us all the time. We're holding on to this anger, making ourselves unhappy, sacrificing our peace of mind. We think we're punishing them, but in reality, we're not. We're only punishing ourselves. So that's a misconception. That's what this student is saying. If we understood those misconceptions, then we would forgive and let go because we'd realize that it's actually benefiting ourselves. That's interesting. Now, a third excerpt. This is another student, and she wrote she took out a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu that she said she really liked. So I'm going to read that quote. "To forgive is not just to be altruistic. It is the best form of self-interest. It's also a process that does not exclude hatred and anger. These emotions are all part of being human. You should never hate yourself for hating others who do terrible things. The depth of your love is shown by the extent of your anger." Okay, very interesting. Now, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, as many of you know, a very, very seminal figure in the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa. He's a priest. Priest. He's actually an archbishop, a very senior priest. Very close friends with the Dalai Lama. Now, this is a very interesting quote because I want you to notice how there's a bit of tension between these three excerpts. If I go back, okay, let's look at excerpt number 1. Let's look at the key components here. It's about empathizing with the other person. Then it's about this internal process of acceptance. It's about directing your focus forward. And then it's about possibly expressing your forgiveness. Now, this second one really pinpoints just the intrapersonal aspect of forgiveness. So if we look at excerpt 1, there's an interpersonal aspect here. 1 is empathizing with the transgressor. That's number 1. And number 4, expressing your forgiveness. But and then 2 and 3 are intrapersonal, right? They're just about what's happening inside me. The student who we're quoting from in excerpt 2 is really talking about just the intrapersonal. He's not really looking at what the transgressor did or trying to empathize with the transgressor or understand the transgressor. He's also not really talking about expressing forgiveness to the transgressor. Not that he's saying we shouldn't do those things, but he's really focusing on that intrapersonal thing and saying really forgiveness is letting go of anger. It's about recognizing that anger is harming me, that letting go of hatred and anger. And now we see the third excerpt, which says, hey, it's a process that does not exclude hatred and anger. Okay, now really interesting. The depth of your love is shown by the extent of your anger. Very interesting. A little bit of a tension there with number 2, I think. But this quote, I went up and looked up the larger context that this quote came from. And if we go on and listen to more of what Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, I think it also helps us to understand this really great quote. So he goes on and says, and here's a little picture of him with the Dalai Lama. They're great friends. It's great to see them together because they're always laughing and poking each other and making fun of each other and just having a great time. They're just like 2 little kids, 2 very wise kids, I would say. So this is what Archbishop Desmond Tutu says after that that earlier quote. He goes on to say, however, when I talk of forgiveness, I mean the belief that you can come out the other side a better person than the one being consumed by anger and hatred. Remaining in that state locks you in a state of victimhood, making you almost dependent on the perpetrator. If you can find it in yourself to forgive, then you are no longer chained to the perpetrator. You can move on, and you can even help the perpetrator to become a better person too. Beautiful, beautiful quote. So when we put these two together, I think we can understand a little bit better that what Archbishop Desmond Tutu is saying and what I think this third student is saying is not so different to what the other 2 students are saying, which is that part of the process of forgiveness might include, a bit of that hatred and anger. So being on the process of forgiveness doesn't mean you're just going to get rid of that anger and hatred right away. And he's saying you shouldn't, then pile on top of that, hating yourself for the fact that you still have hatred and anger. But he also says, as part of that process, eventually you believe, you have the hope that you can come out the other side, that you can free yourself from anger and hatred. Because if you stay in that place of anger and hatred, you're staying in a place of victimhood, and you're actually always linked to that perpetrator. You're always a prisoner of your hatred. You're chained to that perpetrator. So a lot of the themes from what the students wrote in terms of freedom is really coming through in this quote also. So there's really focus on the process here. There's a little bit more of the quote. But the process of forgiveness also requires acknowledgement on the part of the perpetrator that they have committed an offense. Okay, so the Archbishop throws us a bit of a curveball here. None of our students had this. It's a bit of a provocative statement. We've been talking about intrapersonal forgiveness, about just saying that, I'm gonna forgive to let go of anger within myself. Here, the Archbishop is saying the process of forgiveness also requires acknowledgement on the part of the perpetrator that they've committed an offense. This makes sense coming from the context, the role that Archbishop Desmond Tutu played in the truth and reconciliation process, which is what happened in South Africa after apartheid. That he wants to show that part of the process of forgiveness can involve this interpersonal aspect. And so here we're talking about outer reconciliation. So it's always important for us to keep in mind that forgiveness involves an intrapersonal process, which is letting go of anger, and it involves an interpersonal process also, which may or may not happen. Now, it's interesting because some of the readings we're doing, the interviews with Richard Moore, he says this isn't necessary. He really focuses on the intrapersonal, and our student with the second excerpt also really focused on the intrapersonal. Other students and other voices like Archbishop Desmond Tutu are also including the interpersonal. So it's just good to know there's not a right way or a wrong way. It's just good to understand that when we talk about forgiveness, we could be talking about two different things. Richard Moore calls it inner reconciliation, that's the intrapersonal, and outer reconciliation, which is your engagement with others, that's the interpersonal. That's what Archbishop Desmond Tutu is talking about here. Now, this also raises another way we can think about forgiveness. We can talk about conditional forgiveness and unconditional forgiveness. Now, if the Archbishop was talking in this quote, saying that your forgiveness, even intrapersonally inside you, requires acknowledgement on the part of the perpetrator that they've committed an offense, like requires that they say they're sorry or they understand the harm they've caused, then that would be conditional forgiveness. It means you're only forgiving on the condition that somebody else is punished or they apologize or so on and so forth. Unconditional forgiveness means even if the other person doesn't apologize, you still forgive them anyway. Now, here's where it's really important that we just have this distinction between intrapersonal and interpersonal forgiveness, because I don't think the Archbishop is saying we should have conditional forgiveness intrapersonally, because that would mean I only forgive others when they say they're sorry. Now, we actually know through research in psychology that people who only practice conditional forgiveness, they only forgive when someone else says they're sorry, live shorter than people who practice unconditional forgiveness. It's really interesting. They're healthier. So it's healthier to practice unconditional forgiveness. So I think we have to remember that the Archbishop here in this quote is talking about the interpersonal process of forgiveness. For reconciliation, the perpetrator, it's easier if the perpetrator admits they've committed an offense. Now, actually, even for outer reconciliation, there are people who might disagree with this quote. Richard Moore seems to take a slightly different approach. So just different points of view. Forgiveness is complicated business. You also wrote about, in your papers, you wrote about decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. Now, emotional forgiveness is that intrapersonal letting go of anger. It is genuine forgiveness. Decisional forgiveness, though, is important too. It's when I say, I've decided to forgive this person. Now, that doesn't mean I've fully forgiven them. And I think decisional forgiveness shows us about the process of forgiveness, which is what the Archbishop was talking about. So we have forgiveness as kind of this absolute letting go of anger. Then we have the process of how we get there. And that decision can be important. So actually, some students said, decisional forgiveness is not really forgiveness. Well, that's a good point of view. But the decision to forgive can be very important because we have Richard Moore, for example, saying forgiveness is a choice. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. So choice implies you make a decision. You have a choice before you. You can make a decision to forgive or not forgive. When you make that decision to forgive, it doesn't mean instantly you forgive. It doesn't mean you instantly have emotional forgiveness, but it does mean you've decided to go down that path. And hopefully that path is eventually going to get you there. So one question that I have that you can write about in your responses is, which of these conceptions of forgiveness or aspects of them resonates with your own understanding? So we've looked at different sides. There's no right or wrong answers here. Which of these resonates with your own life? Which side of the debates are you gonna stake your claim? Now, in the second part of this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about another one of the readings, which is the book that we're reading through, Healing Anger, by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, this book comes from a certain tradition, which I want to talk about, so you understand a bit more of the context of where the Dalai Lama is coming from when he talks about anger, forgiveness, patience, and so on. The tradition that the Dalai Lama is drawing from, and he talks about this early in the book, is the Lojong tradition. Lojong is a Tibetan word that means mind training. Lo means mind, and Zhong means to train, to purify, to transform. So mind training really means changing our perspective and cultivating a mind that is a compassionate mind, that's a forgiving mind, away from a kind of ordinary mind that might have anger, hatred, resentment, and so forth. So it's a series of practices and teachings to help us in this regard. It arose in the Buddhist tradition, although my own interest in it and the interest among psychologists is really just as a practice of training the mind, not really having anything to do with religion, but how do we cultivate forgiveness and compassion. Two of the seminal figures in the Lojong tradition that the Dalai Lama talks about are Shantideva, who wrote the text that the Dalai Lama is commenting on in the book Healing Anger, and Atisha, who now both of these are Indians. So they were down in India in the 8th century and the 11th century, the Common Era. Atisha actually then went into Tibet and brought the Lojong tradition to Tibet. And we have Atisha in the, I think Atisha is the one, I got confused here. One of these two fingers is, Atisha is the one in the lower left-hand corner, and Shantideva is the one in the upper right-hand corner. These are traditional paintings. And here we have a little map showing you where Tibet is. It is the colored area on this map, actually, across the Himalayas from India. Interesting thing about Atisha, who brought this training of cultivating compassion, patience, forgiveness into Tibet, is that, and this story illustrates really what Lojong is really all about. When Atisha came into Tibet, he had a servant who was kind of his tea, the guy who made his tea, and was his attendant, basically, his attendant, and. But when he came into Tibet, his Tibetan students really revered him as this great Indian master who was bringing these wonderful traditions of basically what we would call positive psychology now. Back then, they didn't have that term. They had the term Lojong. And Atisha was bringing it. He was really respected, and they loved this guy because he had so much knowledge, and he was helping them and bringing this tradition to their whole country from India. And there weren't many people left in India who really knew this tradition. There were very, very few. In fact, Atisha was one of 3. But the tea attendant that he had brought along, this tea server, was a very rude, rough, coarse kind of guy, and he didn't treat Atisha with a lot of respect. And so Atisha's Tibetan students didn't like this guy at all. They thought, this guy is so rude, and he's not treating the master with respect. One day they got together, they pooled their money, they took this attendant aside when Atisha wasn't there, and they said, look, why don't you just go back to India? We've gathered some money, you take off, leave the master here with us, we're going to take good care of him, and you just go off, just leave, go into retirement, And they were trying to get rid of him because they really didn't like this guy. They thought he was a bad guy. Now, Atisha, the next day, he finds out about this. He gathers his students together and he says, I'm not very pleased with all of you. And the reason why I'm not pleased is because you all have tried to get rid of my object of patience. So what he's saying is that he acknowledged that this guy is a difficult guy, but he wanted this difficult guy around him because only by having a difficult guy around him was he going to be tested, was his patience going to be tested. And what he wants to do as a spiritual practitioner, as a practitioner of Lojong, of this early positive psychology, is he wants to train his mind to have more patience, more compassion, more forgiveness. And he realizes the only way he can do that is to be tested, to have this guy who's there. So in the Lojong tradition, now this is the opposite of our ordinary perspective, right? We want to get rid of anybody who causes us problems. We don't appreciate people who are annoying. But for a Lojong practitioner like Atisha, he wanted to have some, at least one annoying person around him, because that person is going to teach him how to be more forgiving, more patient. So he called him, this attendant, his object of patience. And that really shows us what mind training is about. It's about strengthening your mind, building up this muscle, as if patience, forgiveness, compassion, wisdom, understanding were muscles that we could develop and therefore need to be tested. Now, another thing that's important to know about the Lojong tradition and in this book is this term sopa. So the Dalai Lama explains, when we talk about patience, forgiveness, tolerance, resilience, these are all different words in English, but some languages have one word that kind of contains all of that. And we don't have a word for that in English. So the Dalai Lama is talking about, and Shantideva is the text he's commenting on. So Shantideva and the Dalai Lama are talking about how do we cultivate sopa, which is patience, forgiveness, resilience. It's kind of this inner strength. So what is sopa? And we don't really have a perfect word for it in English. So we can, translate it as patience, endurance, tolerance, forgiveness, courage, resilience. There are three different forms of it, or it can express itself in three different ways. The patience of not retaliating harm. So this is the one I guess we'd say is most closely associated with forgiveness. So someone hurts you, harms you, insults you, whatever, or harms your interests or harms your family or things you care about, and you don't get angry towards them. You don't want to hurt them back. You don't want to retaliate. That is sopa. Then we have the patience of accepting hardships. So, you get diagnosed with a really bad illness, or one of your loved ones gets diagnosed with an illness, or you get into a car accident, or something you were really hoping that would happen doesn't happen, or something really bad that you were afraid was going to happen does happen. Those are hardships. Now, we could crumble under those, or we can have this inner fortitude, this patience, this sopa, this endurance. That's also sopa. So it's a strength of mind. And then there's the patience of seeing reality. So when we understand why things are the way they are, we have a kind of patience, we have a tolerance, we accept the way things are. When we don't understand the way things are, we might resist reality. So understanding is also a very important aspect of sopa and patience. So, but these are all one word in Tibetan. So it's really interesting. Now, Sanskrit has a word called kshanti, not shanti meaning peace, but kshanti with a K in front of it, which also means patience. It's the same as sopa, patience in this richer sense. And Arabic has a word too, interestingly enough, called hilm. It's actually one of the names of God in Islam, al-Halim. And hilm means to be forbearing, clement, forgiving, calm, not giving into anger. And it's an inner strength. It's an inner power that even when someone offends you or situations are really bad, you don't lose your mind. You have this inner strength. And you don't give in to anger because anger clouds your judgment. Whereas Hilm allows you to retain judgment and wisdom even in the face of challenge. So it's very, very similar to this word sopa. So this term exists in other languages, but strangely it doesn't exist in English. Now, it's interesting because forgiveness can seem like a kind of passive, weak thing. Sopa is not. So, and Hilm is not. These are words that really connote inner strength. And so they're great when thinking about forgiveness because it shows that forgiveness really is a sign of tremendous inner strength. And being able to keep your cool and being able to think, calmly and wisely in a situation. So it's really good to have these terms and try and understand them. Now, one final question, and you can either answer one or the other of these two questions, or you can answer both if you want to. But, why would these languages like Tibetan have one term for all three kinds of sopa? And do you think that, these different things, that we see in Tibetan and in Arabic, forbearance, clemency, forgiving, calmness, tolerance, are these all just different things, or are you able to conceptualize these as somehow being united in one term. It's really interesting when we think about psychology, we think about mental states. We have to give them names, and we take those names from our languages. Different cultures have different words, and they conceptualize these things differently. Is there something we can learn from other languages, other cultures? Or do you see these things as really distinct and very separate, and it's hard for you to bring them together? So thanks for watching this second presentation, and thanks for your participation in the class.